My name is Rachel Morrison, and for 8 years, I believed I was the good daughter. At 42, I'd sacrificed vacations, worked overtime, and written check after check to keep my family financially stable. $352,000 later, I thought we understood each other. Then came New Year's Eve 2024. My parents gathered us in the living room with champagne, and that excited energy you feel before opening Christmas presents. Except this time I wasn't getting a gift. I was getting a lesson in betrayal that would cost my family everything they thought they knew about loyalty, money, and consequences. What do you do when the people who raised you to be responsible decide you're too responsible to deserve anything in return? And what happens when the family ATM finally decides to shut down permanently? Let me take you back to where it began. I should have seen it coming. The way my parents kept exchanging those little glances across the dinner table, how my sister Jessica kept fidgeting with her wine glass, and most telling of all, how everyone seemed just a little too excited about this particular New Year's Eve celebration. But I was exhausted from another brutal quarter at Dish Network, and honestly, I just wanted to enjoy a quiet evening with my family in the house where I grew up. The Colonial on Sheridan Boulevard looked exactly the same as it had every December for the past 20 years. Mom had hung the same gold streamers from the living room ceiling, and Dad had set up his collection of champagne flutes on the kitchen counter, the ones we only used for special occasions. The whole house smelled like her famous honey ham and those dinner rolls that took her all afternoon to make from scratch. Jessica was there with Emma and Tyler, my 8- and 6-year-old niece and nephew, who were running around the house in their pajamas, even though it was only 8 o'clock. Emma kept asking when we were going to watch the ball drop, and Tyler had already spilled grape juice on Mom's good tablecloth. Normal family chaos or so, I thought. I had driven over from my apartment in lower downtown after finishing up some year-end reports, feeling that familiar mix of love and obligation that always came with family gatherings. 8 years. That's how long I'd been writing checks to keep this whole scene possible. $2,200 every month to Mom and Dad for the mortgage and utilities, another $1,800 to Jessica since her divorce 2 years ago. It had become such a routine that I barely thought about it anymore. Family takes care of family, right? That's what Mom always said. Dad seemed unusually energetic for a 67-year-old man. He'd been retired from Lockheed Martin for 3 years now, ever since they laid off half the factory supervisors, and he'd been struggling to find his rhythm ever since. Mom still did bookkeeping for a few small businesses around Lakewood, but that barely covered groceries. Without my help, I knew they'd lose the house they'd worked so hard to buy back in 1998, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, some kind of electric anticipation that had nothing to do with the approaching midnight hour. Jessica kept looking at her phone and then at our parents like she was waiting for some kind of signal. Mom couldn't sit still, constantly getting up to check on food that didn't need checking, adjusting decorations that were already perfect. When Dad suggested we open the champagne at 11:30 instead of midnight, I knew something was up. Robert Morrison was a creature of habit, and in 42 years of knowing him, he had never deviated from his New Year's Eve timeline. Champagne at midnight, resolutions at 12:15, bed by 1. But here he was popping corks, while Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve was still showing performances from Times Square. Mom handed out the glasses with hands that shook just slightly, and I noticed she'd given Jessica and the kids sparkling cider instead of champagne. The kids didn't usually get to stay up this late, and Emma was already rubbing her eyes, fighting off sleep. That's when Dad cleared his throat in that particular way that meant he had something important to say. The same throat clearing that had preceded my college graduation speech, Jessica's wedding toast, and every other major family announcement of my adult life. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box with a big red bow, the kind of box that usually held jewelry, or maybe a watch. Jessica's eyes got wide, and for a moment I wondered if they were announcing an engagement. Had Mom and Dad renewed their vows? Were they planning some big trip? Dad walked over to Jessica and placed the box in her hands with ceremony that felt rehearsed. She opened it carefully like she knew what was inside, and I watched her face change from nervous excitement to something I couldn't quite read. She pulled out a set of keys attached to a keychain shaped like a house, and underneath them folded papers that looked official. The house deed, with Jessica's name on it. Mom started clapping like she'd just witnessed the most beautiful moment in human history, and Dad was grinning from ear to ear, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat getting louder and louder. "Happy New Year, sweetheart," Dad said to Jessica, his voice warm with the kind of pride I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "This house is yours now. Consider it our New Year's gift to help you and the kids start fresh." I set down my champagne glass before I could drop it, the bubbles suddenly tasting flat and bitter on my tongue. Emma was asking what was happening, and Tyler was tugging on Jessica's sleeve, but their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater. Then my parents turned to me, and their expressions shifted. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like pity mixed with dismissal. "Evelyn," Mom said, using the same tone she'd used when I was 12, and she was explaining why I couldn't have a sleepover on a school night. "From now on, you're on your own. You have your career and that nice apartment downtown. You don't need us anymore." The room went completely silent, except for the distant sound of fireworks starting to go off somewhere in the neighborhood. Other families were celebrating the new year while mine was busy imploding. Something inside me shifted in that moment like a gear clicking into place after years of grinding wrong. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder and clearer than anything I'd felt in a long time. I looked around the room at these people who'd raised me, fed me, taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, and suddenly I saw them differently. The laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest surprised me. It wasn't happy laughter. It was the kind of bitter sound that comes when you finally understand a joke that's been told at your expense for years. "Thanks for the lesson," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "But don't expect me to be there when you need me." I set my champagne flute down on the coffee table with more force than necessary, and the sharp clink made everyone jump. Emma started to cry, not understanding why the grown-ups were being scary, and Tyler wrapped himself around Jessica's leg like he always did when things got tense. The silence stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Dad's mouth was opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. Mom had gone pale under her carefully applied makeup, probably realizing for the first time that this might not go the way they'd planned. Jessica was the first one to find her voice. "Come on, Evelyn, don't be dramatic. This is good news. I need this house more than you do. You've got your fancy downtown apartment and your big shot marketing job." Her words hit me like cold water. Dramatic. That's what they were calling 8 years of keeping this family financially afloat. Dramatic. I walked to the front window and looked out at the Sheridan Boulevard I'd grown up on. The Johnsons across the street had their living room lights on, probably watching the ball drop with their grandkids. Normal people doing normal family things without elaborate financial schemes and surprise betrayals. The drive back to my apartment took forever, even though it was only 15 minutes from Lakewood to lower downtown. I kept replaying the whole evening in my head, looking for signs I should have caught. How long had they been planning this? When did they decide that Jessica deserved the house, and I deserved nothing? My building's parking garage felt like a sanctuary when I finally pulled in. 23rd floor, corner unit floor, to ceiling windows, overlooking the South Platte River. I'd bought this place 3 years ago with money I'd saved by skipping vacations and working overtime, proud that I could afford something nice in the heart of Denver. Now it felt like evidence of my guilt, proof that I didn't need help, so therefore didn't deserve consideration. I poured myself a real drink, not champagne, but the good whiskey I kept for special occasions, and sat on my balcony despite the January cold. The city spread out below me, all those lights representing families and lives I'd never know. Some of them probably dealing with their own versions of tonight's drama. Some of them probably wondering how they'd gotten so tangled up in family obligations that they'd forgotten to protect themselves. That's when the weight of it really hit me. 8 years of automatic transfers, emergency payments, crisis management, and endless guilt trips disguised as gratitude. I'd been so busy being the responsible one that I'd never stopped to ask what I was actually getting in return, besides the privilege of being taken for granted. I thought about all the times I'd worked late to earn extra money for their emergencies, the vacation to Europe I'd canceled when Dad needed dental work, the new car I'd put off buying because Jessica needed help with her divorce lawyer, the promotions I'd probably missed because I was always stressed about family finances instead of focused on my career. They'd made me complicit in my own financial exploitation, and the worst part was, I'd done it willingly because I thought that's what love looked like. My phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, and I knew what I had to do. The banking app opened with my fingerprint, showing all those neat little rows of automatic payments scheduled for the first of every month. Mortgage assistance for Mom and Dad. Rent help for Jessica. Utility payments. Emergency fund transfers. $352,000. That's what the calculator told me when I added up 8 years of supporting a family who apparently saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM they could discard when they found a better solution. My finger hovered over the cancel button for each automatic payment. One click and it would all stop. One click and they'd have to figure out how to live without me. One click and I'd find out what my life looked like when I stopped setting myself on fire to keep other people warm. The first cancellation went through with a soft chime, then the second, then the third. By the time I was done, my phone showed nothing but confirmation messages and zeroed out payment schedules. I managed to sleep for exactly 3 hours before my phone started ringing. The caller ID, said Mom, and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By 7 in the morning, I had 12 missed calls and a voice mailbox full of increasingly frantic messages, ranging from confused to angry to downright nasty. The first week of January passed in a blur of ignored phone calls and deleted text messages. I went to work, came home, ordered takeout, and pretended my family didn't exist. It was easier than I'd expected, which probably should have told me something about the state of our relationships. But by the second week, they'd figured out where I worked. I was in the middle of reviewing Q4 campaign results when my assistant knocked on my office door at the Dish Network building in the Denver Tech Center. There was something in her expression that made my stomach clench. "Your mother is online too," she said quietly. "She says it's urgent." I stared at the blinking light on my phone for a full 30 seconds before I picked up. Evelyn Marie Morrison, Mom's voice, came through the speaker sharp enough to cut glass. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm working, Mom. At my job. The one that's been paying your bills for the last 8 years. Don't you dare get smart with me. Do you have any idea what you've done? The mortgage payment didn't go through. The electric company is threatening to shut off our power. Your father is having chest pains from the stress." The chest pains were a new touch. Dad had been having chest pains for every family crisis since I was 16. They'd never once resulted in an actual heart attack, but they were always mentioned when guilt was needed. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "But you have a house worth $650,000 now. I'm sure you can figure something out." There was silence on the other end. The kind of silence that meant she was realizing for the first time that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. "Jessica can't afford this house, Mom," finally said, her voice smaller than before. "We thought you'd keep helping until she got on her feet. You thought wrong." After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the Rocky Mountains in the distance and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. I called Mike Sullivan, a private investigator I'd met through work when we needed background checks for a corporate partnership. Mike was the kind of guy who'd seen everything twice and wasn't surprised by anything anymore. He listened to my story without judgment while taking notes in a small leather notebook that looked like it had been through several decades of family drama cases. "What exactly are you looking for, Rachel?" "The truth. I want to know what they've really been doing with my money all these years." Mike's investigation took 2 weeks, and what he found made my New Year's Eve betrayal look like a minor disagreement. The manila folder he handed me across the table at a Starbucks near my office was thick with bank statements, loan documents, and email printouts that painted a picture of deception so complete it took my breath away. Your parents took out a home equity loan in October of last year, he said, flipping through the papers. $180,000. Your sister Jessica co-signed as a resident of the property, claiming she contributed to the mortgage payments. Jessica had never lived in that house as an adult except for a 3-month period right after her divorce when she was supposedly getting back on her feet. Here's where it gets interesting, Mike continued. The loan payments they've been making. They match almost exactly with the money you've been sending them each month. They've been using your financial support to service debt you didn't even know existed. I stared at copies of bank statements that showed a pattern of deception going back months. Every dollar I'd sent to help with their mortgage had actually been going to pay off money they'd borrowed against the house. I thought I was helping them keep. It gets worse, Mike said, pulling out another set of documents. I found email exchanges between your parents and an elder law attorney from July. They've been planning this transfer for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Look at this. The email printout showed a conversation between my father and some lawyer in Lakewood discussing asset protection strategies and the best way to transfer property to avoid potential claims. There was even a line about timing the transfer to minimize family disruption. They'd been planning to cut me out since the middle of last summer, all while smiling at family barbecues and accepting my money with grateful hugs and promises that they'd pay me back someday when things got better. The last document in the folder was the most damaging. Jessica's divorce decree, which showed $40,000 in credit card debt that had been her responsibility alone. Debt she'd never mentioned when she'd been asking me for money every month to help with basic living expenses. I sat in that coffee shop until they started putting chairs on tables around us, reading through 8 years of financial lies and manipulation disguised as family love. Everything I'd believed about helping my struggling family had been built on deception, and I'd been too trusting, too guilty, too programmed to be the responsible one to ask the right questions. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing that while I'd been working overtime and skipping vacations to support them, they'd been in lawyers' offices planning my financial funeral. Armed with Mike's folder of evidence, I decided it was time for the extended family to learn what had really been happening behind their backs. Aunt Patricia had invited everyone to her place in Highlands Ranch for a belated New Year's gathering, one of those sprawling suburban houses with the granite countertops and open floor plans that made every conversation echo. I arrived late on purpose after everyone had settled in with their drinks and the usual small talk about jobs and weather. The whole clan was there. Uncle Stephen, Dad's younger brother who'd always been the family peacemaker. Cousin Lisa and her husband Tom. Even Great Aunt Dorothy, who was pushing 90 but never missed a family gathering. Mom and Dad were holding court in the living room, no doubt, spinning their version of recent events. I could see Jessica in the kitchen helping Pat with the coffee service, Emma and Tyler running around with their cousins. Normal family chaos except for the undercurrent of tension that followed me like a storm cloud. Patricia hugged me at the door, but her expression was careful, guarded. I knew the family had already chosen sides based on whatever story they'd been told. "We need to talk, Rachel," she said quietly. "Your parents are really struggling. Jessica's trying to keep that house together for those babies, and everybody's wondering why you've just disappeared." That's exactly what I was hoping someone would say. I set my banker's box down on Pat's granite kitchen island with enough force to get everyone's attention. The conversations in both rooms gradually died down as people realized something was about to happen. Since everyone seems to have opinions about my recent decisions, I figured you should see the whole picture. I started pulling out documents, spreading them across the island like a dealer laying out cards. 8 years of bank statements printed in chronological order. Emergency payment records. Text message screenshots printed on regular copy paper. The home equity loan documents Mike had uncovered. The divorce decree showing Jessica's hidden debt. Stephen wandered over, first drawn by curiosity. His expression changed as he picked up one of the bank statements and started reading. "Jesus, Rachel, is this what you've been sending them every month? $2,200 to Mom and Dad. $1,800 to Jessica. Every month for 8 years without fail." More family members drifted over, drawn by Stephen's reaction. I watched their faces change as they processed what they were seeing. Cousin Lisa picked up one of the emergency payment records and let out a low whistle. $1,500 for Jessica's car repair, $800 for Emma's dental work, $2,000 when Dad needed that root canal. These are just from last summer. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the kids had stopped running around, sensing that something important was happening in the grown-up world. Mom finally spoke up from the living room doorway, her voice shaky. "Evelyn, what do you think you're doing? I'm showing everyone what family loyalty actually looks like," I said, pulling out the most damaging document. "This is the home equity loan Mom and Dad took out in October. $180,000 with Jessica as co-signer. Look at the monthly payment amount, then look at what I've been sending them for mortgage help." Patricia leaned over the papers, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "The payments match exactly," she said quietly. "That's because they've been using my money to pay off debt I didn't even know existed. While I was working overtime to help with their mortgage, they were actually borrowing against the house and using my payments to cover it up." The silence stretched out until Great Aunt Dorothy, bless her 90-year-old heart, cut right to the chase. "So they've been lying to you about money for how long?" "At least 8 months, maybe longer." Stephen was still going through the papers, shaking his head. "Bob," he called to the living room, "you need to see this." Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. His face had gone gray the way it did when he was really stressed. "I don't know what she's told you, but family business should stay in the family. This stopped being family business when you involved lawyers and planned my financial funeral," I said, pulling out the email printouts. "These are from July. 6 months of planning how to cut me out while still taking my money." Patricia read the lawyer emails twice, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she looked up at her brother-in-law with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. "Bob Morrison," she said, in the voice she'd probably used on her 5th-grade students for 30 years. "You should be ashamed of yourself." The kitchen erupted into overlapping conversations, questions, accusations, and demands for explanations. Jessica started crying, saying she'd never meant for any of this to happen, that she'd just signed papers when Dad asked her to. Dad was trying to explain about financial planning and protecting family assets. Mom was insisting that everything they'd done was legal and justified. But Stephen cut through all the noise with one simple question that silenced everyone. "Bob, in all this financial planning and asset protection, did it ever occur to you to just ask Rachel if she was willing to keep helping? Or did you just assume she'd keep writing checks forever, no matter how you treated her?" The answer was written all over Dad's face, and suddenly every person in that kitchen understood exactly what kind of family dynamics they'd been defending. While the extended family was still processing the truth about 8 years of financial deception, Jessica was facing a reality that no amount of family drama could fix. March in Colorado brought the kind of late winter bills that crushed dreams and empty bank accounts, and the 4-bedroom colonial that had seemed like such a gift 2 months earlier was turning into a financial death trap. The first shock came from XL Energy. $347 for February alone, and that was with the thermostat set to 65 degrees. The house had been built in the 80s with insulation that belonged in the 50s, and every window seemed to leak cold air like it was trying to air condition the whole neighborhood. Jessica had called me crying about the electric bill, but I'd stopped answering her calls after the 3rd desperate voicemail. Then came the property tax notice. Jefferson County wanted their money, and it turned out Mom and Dad were 4 months behind. $1,800 due immediately, with penalties adding up daily. Jessica had stared at that notice for 3 days before accepting that her part-time target salary couldn't even make a dent in it. By mid-March, the house had become a choose-your-own-adventure of financial disasters. Heat or groceries, electricity or gasoline, water bill or Emma's school supplies. There was never enough money for everything, and Jessica was learning what I'd been subsidizing all those years. I heard about her troubles through Patricia, who'd maintained contact with Mom despite the family civil war that followed our kitchen table confrontation. Jessica had started drinking more, something that had been a problem during her marriage, but had seemed under control since the divorce. Now she was buying wine at the grocery store when she should have been buying milk, telling herself she deserved something to take the edge off after dealing with bills she couldn't pay and a house she couldn't afford. The kids were starting to notice. Emma's teacher at Lakewood Elementary had called twice about incomplete homework and falling asleep in class. Tyler had started having accidents again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. Children absorb stress like sponges, and no amount of mommy's happy voice could hide the fact that their world was falling apart. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late March, when Jessica woke up to no hot water and a kitchen faucet that produced nothing but air and gurgling sounds. The water had been shut off, and she'd missed the final notice because it had gotten buried under a pile of other bills she couldn't pay. She showed up at Emma's school unwashed, wearing yesterday's clothes, trying to explain to the principal why her daughter would need to use the bathroom at school to brush her teeth. That's when Child Protective Services got involved, not because Jessica was a bad mother, but because 8-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about whether they'll have running water when they get home. The CPS visit was routine, just a wellness check triggered by the school's concern, but it documented everything Jessica had been trying to hide. The house that looked impressive from the street was freezing inside with a thermostat set to 58 degrees and space heaters running in just the bedrooms. The refrigerator had some lunch meat, a half-gallon of milk, and 3 bottles of white wine. The pantry held mostly pasta and canned soup, the kind of survival shopping you do when every dollar counts. But what really scared me hearing about it later through Patricia was the look the social worker described in Jessica's eyes. Not defiant or angry, but defeated. Like she'd finally realized that getting everything she'd wanted was going to destroy her. That's when Jessica decided to take matters into her own hands in the most spectacularly inappropriate way possible. I was in a client meeting at Dish Network, going over quarterly marketing projections with the regional sales team, when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. Her face was white, the way it gets when something has gone very wrong. "There's a situation in the lobby," she said quietly. "Security is asking for you." I excused myself and took the elevator down to the main floor, where I found Jessica standing near the reception desk with Emma, and Tyler flanked by 2 very professional-looking security guards. Jessica's hair looked like she'd slept in her car, and she was clutching Tyler's hand so tightly I could see his little fingers turning red. The kids looked mortified, Emma staring at the floor and Tyler starting to cry as office workers walked past, staring at the scene. Evelyn Jessica called out when she saw me loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear. "We need to talk. Right now." The security guards looked at me apologetically. "She says she's your sister, ma'am. She's been here for 20 minutes asking to see you. And when we explained about appointment procedures, she got upset." Upset was a diplomatic way to describe whatever had happened before I got there. Jessica's eyes were red and wild, and I could smell wine on her breath even from 6 feet away. It was barely noon on a Tuesday, and she'd brought my niece and nephew to my workplace while drunk. Emma looked up at me with eyes full of shame and confusion, and my heart broke for both those kids who were learning that adults couldn't always be trusted to make good decisions. The workplace humiliation was just the beginning of what became the longest afternoon of my professional life. After security escorted Jessica and the kids to the parking lot, I spent 2 hours in meetings with HR, explaining a family situation that sounded insane even to me. My boss wanted to know if I needed time off to deal with personal issues. My colleagues were asking if everything was okay. The whole thing was a nightmare of professional embarrassment wrapped around a family crisis I couldn't fix. But Jessica's desperate ambush had given me something I hadn't expected: clarity. I called Jennifer Walsh that evening from my apartment, looking out at the Denver skyline, while I explained 8 years of family financial manipulation to a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of mess. Jennifer had one of those calm, professional voices that made you feel like your problems were manageable even when they weren't. She listened to my whole story without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or amounts, taking notes I couldn't see through the phone. "Rachel," she said, "when I finished, what your family did is a textbook case of financial exploitation, and you have more legal options than you probably realize." The consultation took place the next day, at her office in Cherry Creek, one of those glass towers that made you feel like serious business was being conducted inside. Jennifer had prepared a thick folder of Colorado statutes and case law, but she explained everything in terms that made sense to someone who'd never thought about suing her own family. Under Colorado law, sustained financial support without formal loan agreements can still be claimed as debt, especially when there's evidence of deception or misrepresentation. Your parents used your money to secure additional loans while actively planning to exclude you from any benefit. That's problematic from several legal standpoints. She spread out copies of the documents Mike had uncovered, pointing to specific details that suddenly looked different through a legal lens. "This home equity loan is particularly interesting," she continued. "Your sister co-signed by claiming she was a resident who contributed to mortgage payments. Your bank records prove that you are actually making those contributions. That's potential fraud, and it makes Jessica liable for debt that was partially created using your money." The legal strategy Jennifer outlined was more complex than I'd expected, but also more hopeful. Colorado had specific protections for people in my situation, and the documentation I'd gathered was unusually complete for this type of case. "We start with Jefferson County Small Claims Court," she explained. "The limit is $7,500, but it's fast, relatively inexpensive, and it establishes legal precedent for larger claims if we need to pursue them later. We document your most easily proven financial contributions and seek recovery plus court costs." The paperwork took 3 days to prepare and another week to serve properly. Jessica's reaction when she received legal notification was immediate and predictable. She called 17 times in one evening, leaving voicemails that escalated from confused to angry to desperate to threatening. I listened to them all the next morning over coffee, Jessica's voice getting increasingly slurred as the evening had progressed, and she'd apparently worked her way through another bottle of wine. "You can't sue your own sister, Evelyn. This is insane. We're family. Families don't take each other to court over money. Mom and Dad are going to have heart attacks when they find out about this. The kids are asking why Aunt Rachel hates them. How am I supposed to explain that their aunt is trying to take our house away?" But it was the last voicemail that told me everything I needed to know about how serious this had become. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "I talked to Mom and Dad today. They're scared, Evelyn. Really scared. Dad says they might lose the house anyway because they can't make the loan payments without your help, and now with your lawsuit, they can't even try to sell it, because there might be a lien. You're destroying this whole family over money that you gave us freely for years. I never asked you to be our bank, but you did it anyway, and now you're acting like we owe you something for your choice." Her choice to frame 8 years of family financial support as my unilateral decision, rather than their constant requests for help, told me that Jennifer was right about pursuing legal action. This wasn't going to get resolved through family conversations or holiday dinner negotiations. It was going to require official intervention to establish what had actually happened and who was responsible for what. Jennifer filed the preliminary paperwork that Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, I had text messages from family members I hadn't heard from in years, all wanting to know if it was true that I was suing Jessica Mom and Dad. The family phone tree had been working overtime spreading news and collecting opinions about my unprecedented decision to use the legal system against blood relatives. But the most telling reaction came from Mom, who showed up at my apartment building that Tuesday evening, buzzing from the lobby with the kind of urgency usually reserved for medical emergencies. When I finally let her up, she looked smaller than I remembered. Older and more fragile, wearing the navy blue coat she saved for important occasions. "Evelyn, honey," she said, settling into my living room chair like she was visiting a sick friend, rather than confronting a daughter who'd just filed legal action against the family. "We need to talk about this lawsuit business before it goes too far." The conversation with Mom lasted exactly 23 minutes, and every word of it confirmed that hiring Jennifer had been the right decision. Mom alternated between guilt manipulation and outright threats, cycling through every emotional tactic she'd perfected over 4 decades of motherhood. She started with the health angle. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. The doctor says stress could kill him at his age. Is that really what you want on your conscience? Then moved to the grandchildren. Emma asked me why Aunt Rachel doesn't love them anymore. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her aunt cares more about money than family, and finished with the financial devastation narrative? We'll lose everything, Evelyn. 40 years of marriage, 30 years in that house, all gone, because you can't forgive a simple misunderstanding about inheritance planning. I listened to it all without interrupting, which seemed to frustrate her more than arguing would have. When she finally ran out of emotional ammunition, I walked her to the door and said the only thing that mattered. Mom, you planned this for months. You consulted with lawyers. You involved Jessica in fraud. You spent my money to hide your debts. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is what happens when lies catch up with people. The next morning, Maria Santos from Human Resources called me into her office. I'd been dreading this conversation ever since Jessica's lobby scene, but Maria's approach surprised me. Rachel, I want you to know that we've completed our investigation into the incident with your sister last week. Security cameras show that you handled an extremely difficult personal situation with complete professionalism. She pulled out a thin file folder and set it on her desk between us. Your colleagues have been asking how they can support you during this family crisis. Your team lead says you've maintained excellent work quality despite obvious personal stress. Frankly, the way you've kept your private issues from affecting your professional responsibilities is exactly the kind of judgment we value in leadership positions. Leadership positions. That phrase made my heart skip. Which brings me to the main reason I asked you here today. The marketing director position has been approved by senior management. We'd like to offer you the promotion effective immediately, with a salary adjustment to $110,000 annually, plus expanded benefits. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds before the words sank in. After 8 years of working overtime to fund family emergencies, sacrificing vacation time for Jessica's crises, and turning down social opportunities because I was always stressed about family finances, I was finally getting the career recognition I'd earned. The promotion came with a corner office on the 15th floor, a view of the Rocky Mountains, and most importantly, validation that my professional life had value independent of my family's financial needs. For the first time in years, I could make career decisions based on what was best for me, rather than what would generate the most emergency funding for family disasters. My new team threw an impromptu celebration that afternoon, complete with grocery store cake and champagne someone had been saving in the office refrigerator. Standing there with colleagues who'd supported me through the worst family crisis of my adult life, I realized I'd found something I'd been missing for years. People who valued me for my contributions rather than my bank account. But the best part of the promotion was the timing. When Jennifer called that evening to update me on the legal proceedings, I had good news to share, along with the latest family drama developments. Rachel, your case is stronger than most people realize. The documentation you've provided establishes clear patterns of financial deception, and your sister's workplace harassment actually helps demonstrate the level of desperation and manipulation you've been dealing with. She'd received a settlement offer from Jessica's public defender, a laughably low amount that didn't even cover my court costs, much less acknowledge 8 years of financial exploitation. They're hoping you'll take a few $100s and go away quietly. It tells me they know they're in serious legal trouble. The paperwork for rejecting the settlement offer took 5 minutes to review and sign. I was done accepting inadequate solutions to problems I hadn't created. That weekend, I cleaned out my home office, throwing away years of family financial records I'd kept for tax purposes. Emergency payment receipts, desperate text message printouts, bank statements showing transfer after transfer to people who'd never once asked if I could afford to keep giving. The recycling bin filled up with evidence of 8 years spent funding other people's poor decisions while neglecting my own financial goals. Money that could have gone toward a house down payment, early retirement savings, or those European vacations I'd been promising myself someday. But as I shredded the last batch of receipts, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not just because the financial burden was gone, but because I'd finally stopped participating in my own exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. One last attempt at manipulation before we ended up in court. I hope you can live with yourself when this family falls apart completely. When Dad has his heart attack and Mom ends up in some cheap nursing home because they lost their house. When Emma and Tyler grow up knowing their aunt chose money over love. This is your choice, Evelyn, and you'll have to live with the consequences forever. I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations aren't worth having, and some relationships aren't worth saving. The Jefferson County Small Claims Court looked exactly like every other government building I'd ever been in. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and that particular smell of disinfectant mixed with decades of human drama. Jennifer met me in the parking lot at 8:30, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 family disputes. Inside the waiting area was filled with people clutching folders and looking nervous. Landlord-tenant disputes, contractor disagreements, and families like mine who'd reached the point where love wasn't enough to solve their problems anymore. Jessica sat on the opposite side of the room with a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She'd dressed carefully for court, wearing a navy dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 33 years. Mom and Dad flanked her like bodyguards, both of them shooting me looks that could have melted steel. When our case was called, we filed into a small courtroom that felt more like a conference room with a judge's bench. The Honorable Sandra Martinez was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd heard every sob story and excuse ever invented. Jennifer had prepared me for this moment, but actually sitting at the plaintiff's table while my own family sat across the aisle felt surreal. 8 years of financial support had led to this sterile room where strangers would decide who owed what to whom. The presentation of evidence took 2 hours. Jennifer methodically walked through bank statements, transfer records, and loan documents, while Judge Martinez took notes and asked pointed questions. The pattern was undeniable once laid out chronologically. Month after month of financial support coinciding exactly with payments on debt I'd never known existed. Jessica's public defender tried to argue that my financial contributions had been gifts freely given, with no expectation of repayment, but that defense crumbled when Jennifer introduced the email evidence showing premeditated deception and asset protection planning. Then came the testimony phase, and that's when things got really uncomfortable. Dad took the witness stand first, his hands shaking slightly as he swore to tell the truth. Under questioning, he admitted that my financial support had been essential to the family's survival, that they'd never discussed repayment terms because they'd assumed I'd keep helping indefinitely. But it was when Jennifer asked about the home equity loan that his composure completely broke down. Mr. Morrison, did you inform your daughter that you were using her monthly contributions to service debt secured against the property you later gave to your other daughter? No, he said quietly. Did you consider that this might be relevant information for someone providing substantial financial support? We were trying to protect the family assets. By deceiving the family member who was funding those assets, Dad looked across the courtroom at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but something closer to shame. We thought Rachel would understand eventually. She's always been the responsible one. Mom's testimony was worse. She tried to justify 8 years of financial manipulation as caring family planning, but Judge Martinez wasn't buying it. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter provided over $300,000 in financial support while you were consulting with attorneys about excluding her from any benefit of that support. How do you reconcile that? Family is complicated, Your Honor. We did what we thought was best for everyone. Best for everyone except the daughter who was funding it all. But it was Jessica's testimony that really broke my heart. She took the stand wearing that navy dress and started crying before the public defender even asked his first question. "I never wanted any of this to happen," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Evelyn was always so generous, always helping when we needed it. I thought when Mom and Dad gave me the house, she'd be happy that I could finally stand on my own." Judge Martinez leaned forward, slightly studying Jessica's face. "Miss Carter, did you understand that your co-signing the home equity loan made you liable for debt that was being serviced by your sister's financial contributions I just signed where Dad told me to sign? I didn't really understand all the legal stuff. But you understood that you were claiming to contribute to mortgage payments when your sister was actually making those contributions." Jessica's composure cracked completely at that question. Through her tears, she admitted that she'd known the co-signer paperwork was false, but had trusted Dad when he said it was just a formality to help with the loan approval. The most powerful moment came when Judge Martinez asked to speak with Emma privately in her chambers. When they returned 15 minutes later, the judge's expression had changed from professional skepticism to something closer to sadness. "Based on my conversation with the child, it's clear that this family has been operating under financial arrangements that were neither transparent nor sustainable. The evidence shows a pattern of deception spanning months, debt concealment, and systematic financial exploitation disguised as family obligation. She awarded me the maximum $7,500 plus court costs. But more importantly, she established legal precedent for my larger claims and publicly validated everything I'd been saying about my family's financial manipulation." As we filed out of the courtroom, Jessica tried to approach me, but Jennifer smoothly intercepted her. "All future communication goes through legal counsel," she said firmly. I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Vindication. Not just financial but emotional and moral vindication, that I hadn't been crazy or selfish or cruel. I'd been exploited and now there was an official legal record proving it. The legal victory felt hollow when I drove past the house 3 weeks later and saw the foreclosure notice taped to the front door. That official yellow paper flapping in the April wind was like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. Patricia called that evening with details I hadn't asked for but somehow needed to hear. The bank had moved faster than anyone expected once they realized the property was tied up in legal disputes. Mom and Dad had exactly 30 days to vacate the house they'd called home for 26 years. "They're packing everything they own into a U-Haul truck," Pat said, her voice heavy with something between sadness and exhaustion. "Your mother keeps asking if you might change your mind about helping just until they can get back on their feet." The request was so absurd it made me laugh, but not the good kind of laughter. After months of legal battles, court testimony, and official findings of financial deception, they were still hoping I'd rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. Jessica's situation was even worse. Without my monthly support and facing her own legal judgments, she defaulted on every bill associated with the house. Xcel Energy had disconnected the power in March. The water company followed in early April. By the time the foreclosure notice went up, she'd been living in a 4-bedroom house, with no utilities, trying to keep 2 small children comfortable with flashlights and bottled water. Emma's teacher had called Child Protective Services again when the 8-year-old fell asleep at her desk for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. The follow-up visit documented a living situation that was heartbreaking, even by CPS standards. No heat, no electricity, and a single mother whose drinking had progressed from wine with dinner to wine instead of dinner. The emergency custody hearing happened on a Wednesday morning that I knew nothing about until Stephen called me at work. "Your sister's kids are with their father temporarily," he said, without preamble. Jessica had some kind of breakdown at the custody hearing. Started screaming at the judge about how this was all your fault, how you'd destroyed the family over money you'd given freely for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's ex-husband, who'd been deemed an unfit father during their divorce proceedings, was now considered a more stable guardian than she was. But then again, he had electricity and running water in his apartment, which apparently put him ahead of their mother in the basic parenting requirements department. The final blow came in early May when I drove past the house one last time before the sheriff's sale. The moving truck was gone, but the yard was littered with furniture and belongings that hadn't made the cut for the new living situation. Dad's workshop tools spread across the driveway. Mom's garden furniture stacked by the curb like an estate sale nobody wanted to attend. Mrs. Kim from next door was in her front yard surveying the damage to property values that was happening right in her neighborhood. "Such a shame," she said when she saw me. "They were good neighbors for so many years. I never would have imagined it would end this way." I wanted to tell her about the 8 years of financial support, the hidden loans, the planned deception, and the legal battles that had led to this moment. But standing there looking at the house where I'd learned to ride a bike and spent Christmas mornings opening presents, all I could feel was a complicated mix of sadness and relief. The house sold at auction for less than the amount owed on the home equity loan, which meant Jessica was still liable for the difference. Mom and Dad moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Westminster, 30 minutes further from everything they'd known. Jessica found a 1-bedroom place near her ex-husband so she could maintain visitation rights with Emma and Tyler, but even that required help from his new girlfriend to make the security deposit. The whole family had crash-landed in rental apartments scattered across Jefferson County, learning to live within their actual means for the first time in years. No more 4-bedroom colonial, no more financial safety net, no more Aunt Rachel to call when the money ran out before the month did. Stephen visited me that weekend, bringing updates I hadn't requested, but found oddly comforting. "Your dad got a job at Home Depot," he said, settling into my living room with coffee. I'd actually learned to make properly, since I wasn't working overtime to fund family emergencies anymore. "Stocking shelves 40 hours a week." "Your mom's doing bookkeeping for 3 different businesses now. They're managing, but just barely. And Jessica customer service at Comcast. Full-time benefits, actual paychecks she can't spend on wine, because the kid's father is watching her finances as part of the custody arrangement." For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope. Not hope for reconciliation or family healing, but hope that maybe they'd finally learn the difference between want and need, between financial planning and financial manipulation. That night, I stood on my balcony, looking out at the Denver lights, thinking about consequences and choices, and the price of finally putting yourself first in a family that had trained you to come last. The invitation to Dish Network's annual marketing retreat at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs came at exactly the right time. After months of family legal battles and emotional exhaustion, the idea of spending 3 days focused purely on professional development felt like a gift I hadn't realized I needed. The resort was one of those places that made you feel successful just by walking through the lobby. All marble and crystal chandeliers and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. My room overlooked the mountains, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. The first day was standard corporate retreat fare. Team-building exercises, marketing strategy sessions, and networking lunches where everyone tried to look interested in quarterly projections while mentally planning their weekend. But it was during the afternoon workshop on sustainable business practices that I met someone who would change everything about how I thought about relationships and trust. Michael Chen was presenting a case study on affordable housing design, and something about his approach caught my attention. He wasn't just talking about architecture and construction costs. He was talking about families, about communities, about the difference between a house and a home, in terms that made me think he understood something important about what people actually need. During the coffee break, I found myself standing next to him at the pastry table, both of us reaching for the same chocolate croissant. "You can have it," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm supposed to be watching my sugar intake anyway." "I'm Rachel Morrison," I said, accepting the pastry like it was a peace treaty. Michael Chen, interior architect with a sweet tooth and questionable impulse control. We ended up talking through the entire 15-minute break and picking up the conversation again at dinner. Michael had grown up in Westminster, the son of Vietnamese immigrants, who'd sacrificed everything for his education. His parents had worked double shifts at a restaurant they'd never owned, sending every extra dollar toward his college fund while living in a one-bedroom apartment above the kitchen. The pressure had been incredible, he told me over wine, that actually tasted expensive for once. Every decision I made had to justify their sacrifice. Every grade, every job, every relationship got measured against what they'd given up for me. I understood that pressure in ways I couldn't fully explain without sounding like I was competing in the family trauma Olympics. But Michael seemed to get it when I mentioned the complicated dynamics of being the financially successful child in a family that needed help. "It's different when you're the one everyone looks to for solutions," he said quietly. "You start to think your value as a person is tied to how much you can provide for others." We talked until the resort bar closed, and then continued the conversation the next morning over coffee in the lobby. Michael had spent years in therapy working through family guilt and financial boundary setting. His parents had wanted him to support extended family members, fund business ventures that made no sense, and basically become the family bank the way I'd become mine. "But you figured out how to say no," I said, more as a question than a statement. "Eventually." "It took a long time and a really good therapist, but I learned that helping people doesn't always help them. Sometimes it just enables them to avoid learning skills they need to survive on their own." The retreat ended too soon, but Michael asked if I wanted to continue our conversation over dinner in Denver the following weekend. It felt strange being asked on what was clearly a date by someone who knew almost nothing about my recent family disasters, but somehow understood the emotional landscape I was navigating. Patricia called that Thursday with an update I hadn't requested, but found oddly reassuring. "Your parents are adjusting to apartment life," she said. "Your mother's actually enjoying not having to maintain that big house, though she'll never admit it. And your father seems happier with a structured job than he was sitting around retired with nothing to do. What about Jessica? Clean for 6 weeks now. The custody arrangement requires regular drug and alcohol testing, so she's finally getting sober for real. The kids visit every other weekend, and she's actually showing up for them in ways she never did when she had you as backup." That weekend's dinner with Michael took place at a small restaurant in Cherry Creek, the kind of place with excellent food and terrible lighting that made everyone look mysterious and attractive. We talked about family expectations, career goals, and the challenge of building adult relationships when you've spent years being defined by how much you can provide for other people. I found myself telling him about the New Year's Eve betrayal, the legal battles, and the complicated relief of finally putting myself first. He listened without trying to fix anything or offering advice I hadn't asked for, which felt like a miracle after months of well-meaning friends telling me how I should handle my family situation. When he walked me to my car, he asked a question that stayed with me for days afterward. "What does your life look like now that it's actually yours?" I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. For 8 years, my life had been structured around other people's emergencies and needs. Work overtime to fund Jessica's crisis. Skip vacations to cover Dad's medical bills. Turn down social opportunities because I was always stressed about family finances. Now, for the first time since I'd started working, my paycheck was mine to spend on whatever I wanted. My evenings were free for whatever I chose to do. My weekends belonged to me instead of to family drama and financial planning for people who'd never learned to plan for themselves. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like suddenly having permission to want things I'd forgotten I was allowed to want. By summer, the full scope of the family's financial collapse had become clear through a combination of legal documents, family gossip, and the kind of small-town information network that made privacy impossible in Jefferson County. The sheriff's sale had netted less than the outstanding loan balance, leaving Jessica liable for nearly $40,000 in remaining debt that she'd never be able to pay on her Comcast salary. The bankruptcy attorney she'd consulted had explained her options in terms that basically boiled down to 7 years of ruined credit and garnished wages. Mom and Dad's Westminster apartment was a far cry from the spacious colonial they'd called home for over 2 decades. 800 square feet, 2 bedrooms and a kitchenette that barely had room for the microwave and coffee maker. Dad's workshop tools had been sold at the yard sale nobody in the family wanted to talk about. Mom's china cabinet was in storage because there wasn't space for it in the new place. But according to Patricia, who'd maintained contact despite the ongoing family civil war, they were actually managing better than anyone had expected. "Your father likes his job at Home Depot," she told me, over lunch at a Cherry Creek restaurant I could finally afford to enjoy, without calculating how much the meal cost versus family emergency funds. "He's got health insurance again, a regular schedule, and coworkers who seem to appreciate his experience. Your mother's bookkeeping business is growing. She's got 5 clients now, and talks about maybe getting her own office space." The transformation sounded almost too good to be true, like people who'd spent decades avoiding financial responsibility had suddenly developed money management skills overnight. "It wasn't overnight," Pat continued, reading my skeptical expression. "The first few months were rough. Your mother cried a lot. Your father went through a phase where he blamed you for everything. But around March, something shifted. I think they realized that being angry wasn't going to pay the rent." Jessica's situation was more complicated, but potentially more hopeful. The custody arrangement with her ex-husband had forced her into sobriety and financial accountability in ways that years of family intervention had never achieved. She was attending AA meetings 3 times a week and working with a financial counselor who specialized in single mothers rebuilding their lives after divorce. The most surprising development was her relationship with Emma and Tyler. Without the chaos of financial crisis and constant stress about keeping the house, she was actually present for her children in ways she'd never managed before. "She picks them up from school every Tuesday and Thursday," Stephen had told me during one of his periodic updates. "Takes them to the library, helps with homework, makes dinner that doesn't come from a drive-through window. It's like she's learning how to be their mother, instead of just surviving in the same house with them." I used the money from my court settlement and the savings from not supporting 3 households to establish 529 college funds for both kids. $25,000 each, invested conservatively, but positioned to grow over the next decade. Emma and Tyler would have educational opportunities regardless of their parents' financial struggles. The paperwork listed me as the account holder, but specified that the funds could only be used for qualified educational expenses. It was my way of helping the kids, without enabling the adults, a boundary I'd learned to draw, with Jennifer's help during our legal strategy sessions. Michael and I had been seeing each other regularly for 3 months by then, and he'd become my sounding board for navigating the complex emotions of watching my family rebuild their lives without me. He understood the guilt that came with relief, the way you could simultaneously want people to succeed and need to protect yourself from being drawn back into their dysfunction. One evening in July, we were walking around Sloan's Lake after dinner, watching the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, when he asked a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you miss them?" It was such a simple question, but I'd been avoiding thinking about the answer for months. I missed the idea of them, the family I'd thought we were, before I understood how our relationships actually functioned. I missed the version of my parents who'd raised me to be responsible and kind before I realized they'd taught me to be responsible for everyone except myself. "I miss who I thought they were," I said finally. "But I don't miss the constant stress of managing everyone else's financial emergencies. I don't miss working overtime to fund other people's poor decisions. I don't miss feeling guilty every time I bought something for myself because the money could have gone to family crisis management." Michael nodded, squeezing my hand as we continued walking around the lake. "That's healthy," he said. "You can grieve the loss of the family you thought you had while still protecting yourself from the family you actually had." By August, I'd established a routine that felt sustainable and genuinely mine for the first time in years. Work that I enjoyed and was good at. A relationship based on mutual respect and shared interests. Weekends that belonged to me instead of to family drama. Money in my savings account that stayed there instead of disappearing into other people's emergencies. The apartment that had felt like a temporary refuge during the worst of the family crisis now felt like home in ways the childhood house never had. 1 year later, I woke up on New Year's Day 2026 inches my own apartment in my own bed, with no family financial emergencies waiting on my voicemail, and no automatic transfers scheduled to drain my bank account. The contrast to that devastating evening at the Sheridan Boulevard house felt like comparing two different lifetimes. Michael was in the kitchen making coffee, humming something off-key, while he waited for the machine to finish brewing. We'd spent the previous evening at a party with my colleagues from Dish Network, people who knew me as Rachel, the marketing director, rather than Rachel, the family ATM, and we'd stayed until midnight without worrying about anyone else's problems or needs. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Happy New Year, Aunt Rachel. I got an A on my science project about solar energy. Mom says to tell you thank you for my college fund." That monthly call from my niece had become one of the bright spots in a life that was finally structured around my own goals and happiness. Emma was thriving in her new school. Her grades had improved dramatically since the family crisis stabilized, and she talked about wanting to be an engineer when she grew up. Tyler was doing well too, according to the carefully neutral updates I received through Patricia. Jessica had maintained her sobriety for 8 months, now worked her way up to a supervisor position at Comcast, and had even started dating someone she'd met in her AA group. The financial disaster that had destroyed her life had also forced her to rebuild it on more solid foundations than she'd ever learned to create before. Mom and Dad were surviving, and that was probably the best outcome anyone could have hoped for after decades of financial mismanagement. Dad's job at Home Depot provided health insurance and a sense of purpose he'd been missing since retirement. Mom's bookkeeping business was steady enough that they could afford their apartment and even modest entertainment. They'd never be wealthy, but they were learning to live within their means for the first time in their marriage. The legal settlements had been finalized in September, with me recovering about 15% of what I'd actually provided over 8 years. Not enough to make up for the lost savings and delayed retirement planning, but enough to establish those college funds and feel like some kind of justice had been served. More importantly, I'd learned something invaluable about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and financial exploitation, between family loyalty and self-respect. Patricia and Stephen had become my chosen family, the relatives who valued my presence rather than my bank account. We'd established new holiday traditions that felt healthier and more genuine than anything I'd experienced in the old family dynamic. Michael fit into those traditions, naturally bringing his own experience with family boundary setting and the wisdom of someone who'd learned to prioritize his own well-being without guilt. My career had flourished once I wasn't constantly stressed about funding other people's crises. The promotion to marketing director had led to expanded responsibilities, professional recognition, and the kind of job satisfaction that comes from focusing on work instead of family financial emergencies. But the most profound change was internal. I'd spent 8 years believing that my value to my family was entirely financial, that love was measured by how much I could provide when crisis struck. Learning to see myself as someone worthy of respect and consideration regardless of my bank balance had been harder than any legal battle or family confrontation. I'd started volunteering with Jefferson County's financial literacy program, helping other adults recognize and escape family financial manipulation. The stories I heard were depressingly familiar. Adult children funding parents' poor decisions, siblings taking advantage of responsible family members, families using guilt and love as weapons to maintain financial dependence. My story had resonated with more people than I'd expected, and I'd found purpose in helping others establish the boundaries I'd taken too long to create for myself. Standing in my apartment on New Year's Day, looking out at the Denver skyline with Michael's terrible humming providing background music, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete ownership of my own life. No obligations I hadn't chosen. No relationships based on financial transactions. No guilt about prioritizing my own needs and goals. The family that had raised me was gone, replaced by people I barely recognized who were learning to survive without my subsidies. But the chosen family I'd built was stronger and more authentic than anything I'd lost. What do you think about my story? Have you ever found yourself being the family bank, giving and giving, until there was nothing left for your own dreams and goals? If you were in my position, would you have continued sacrificing your financial future for people who saw you as an ATM rather than a family member? Or would you have found the courage to walk away and build a life that actually valued who you are, instead of what you can provide? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. So many of us have been where I was funding other people's poor choices while neglecting our own well-being, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear, to find the strength to choose themselves for once. Subscribe for more stories about family money and the sometimes painful but always necessary journey toward putting your own happiness first when everyone around you expects you to keep giving forever.